Okay, in the last video we looked at how you would answer a question related to evaluating the effectiveness of a particular budgetary policy, and we looked at lowering income taxes. Now we're going to look at how you would answer a similar question but looking at both infrastructure and company taxes. So if you chose infrastructure as your example, you'd define what infrastructure means and you would define the goal of full employment. And then you would talk about the strengths and weaknesses. So the strengths for infrastructure policies for boosting employment is you've got both the short and the long-term benefit. So in the short term, you've got that increase in demand, which should lead to increased G2 spending. It also leads to increased consumption because it creates jobs. You could use the example to flush out your answer talking about the Melbourne to Brisbane Railway and how that's created 16,000 jobs in the short term through the construction phase. And then it also helps boost full employment in the long term once we finish building the infrastructure, because it helps to boost productivity and helps to boost aggregate supply, and therefore in the long term leads to lower prices and increased international competitiveness and therefore the derived demand for labour. Again, you could link to the Brisbane-Melbourne Railway and talk about how that's helped to connect railways with ports and how that's going to boost productivity as well. In terms of weaknesses, you could talk about the negative impacts in the short term, potentially through higher prices as a result of traffic congestion and roadworks and things like that. You could also talk about the long implementation lag. So most infrastructure spending takes a long time to get through Parliament, particularly because it's unpopular because people have to relocate and lose their houses and things like that. Other things is it may conflict with some of the other goals. So, for example, you could argue that it could lead to a budget deficit, which can cause crowding out because it is expenditure in the short term. It can lead to less demand due to higher interest rates because of the crowding out effect. You could also link it to the fact that the increased demand for labour may just reduce underemployment instead of unemployment, but I would say that's probably slightly less relevant. So in terms of your key weaknesses, 1, the short-term impact, 2, the fact that there'd be a long implementation lag, this one's really important, and 3, the fact that it may lead to budget deficits, which can cause crowding out, which hurt growth. But it's important to recognise both the short and the long-term benefits as well. In terms of lower company taxes, you've got some of your strengths that would be, it would add to private investment, so it would boost jobs through higher investment spending. Firms would invest in new technology and machinery and things like that because they've got more cash flow and they've also got to get taxed less on their future profits. You could talk about the benefits for foreign investment, so lower company tax rates would encourage businesses from overseas to potentially set up operations in Australia, and that's a positive because it will lead to more jobs for Australian workers as well. There's the short impact lag. Generally, it has once the policy is in operation, it has a short time before it impacts aggregate demand. You could also link it to the lower cost of production, as firms have lower taxes, which should lead to lower prices, as well as the increased investment boosting productivity in the long term, which can then be linked through increasing demand because of increased international competitiveness. In terms of weaknesses, if you're analysing the weaknesses of our recent company tax cuts, one, which we talked about in class, is that we still have higher rates than countries overseas. So even though we're reducing them, we're still less competitive than a lot of overseas countries because of our higher tax structures. It also means that there's not that much incentive to boost foreign investment, given that our tax rates are still higher than what they are overseas. Crowding out is another weakness. So again, it can cause budget deficits if we have lower company tax rates because the government's collecting less revenue. That can lead to higher interest rates. There's the implementation lag. It can take a while to get through the Senate. The increased spending may just reduce underemployment. And firms may not use the tax cut to invest. They may just absorb the extra profits. So the increase in profits for miners, or any other industry for that matter, may not actually eventuate to increased jobs and increased employment. Just some random questions just to give you a bit of a heads up on some things you could talk about for each of these. This question is asking you to describe one strength and one weakness of using aggregate supply policies for price stability or low inflation. So again, your initial mark would be for defining price stability. In terms of the strengths, you could talk about how it helped to reduce cost structures and prices in particular sectors of the economy. So for example, they can target increasing efficiency and lowering prices through wage subsidies for younger workers, tax concessions for research and development, all these kind of things that are likely to push out our aggregate supply in the long term. The other thing is they can target inflation, and this is a big one. They can target inflation without jeopardising the other goals. So because they focus on cost push inflation, they're able to do things like increase infrastructure spending, training and education, subsidies, which are expansionary policies, but aren't going to have that negative impact on. They can occur without having negative impacts on other goals. So they're not contractionary policies, which you would need to do with demand management policies to reduce inflation. We can actually achieve inflation without it jeopardising the other goals when we use supply-side policies, because we're looking at the supply side of the economy. It can target structural or ongoing problems with the economy, so they can focus with skill shortages in the labour market or a lack of efficiency, and focus on things like immigration and training and education, which will have long-term benefits for aggregate supply and prices. In terms of weaknesses, some policies actually hurt inflation, so some supply-side policies some policies can actually hurt inflation in the short term. So tax concessions for investment, infrastructure spending can actually lead to more demand in the short term, which can actually increase aggregate demand. So that should say short term, my apologies. Some supply policies actually lead to reduced efficiency and higher prices in the long term as well. So if we're using protectionist subsidies, firms may be less efficient. So some policies can cause inflation in the short term, other policies can cause inflation in the long term. The other problem is there's sometimes overseas constraints, so it can be hard for us to encourage other firms overseas to also lower their tariffs on imports and things like that, on our exports, because we rely on cooperation. But having said that, I'll be focusing on these first two. Okay, it's hard because in the short term some of the policies will increase inflation, and in the long term some protectionist policies will actually reduce efficiency as well. Thank you.